So in June 2013, I interviewed a Kyrgyz journalist from Bishkek about gold mining politics. He asked to remain unnamed, as you'll see several of the people I've interviewed have, given some of the difficulties on this topic. This is what he said about protests. People divide into anti and pro-investors camps. You can see this in comment sections of online news stories, in Azatik, for example, or on Facebook discussions. People who respond to some of the local residents' criticism of Kuntur on social media, often city dwellers, they consider near-mine residents as marginal voices, don't take them seriously. They say they don't understand or don't know any better. They are illiterate. People use protests as a sign that they, the residents near the mines, don't care about the environment. So this journalist, in my conversation with him, he talked about paying close attention to the claims and demands that protesters made over time in multiple locations. And by this point in 2013, really beginning in 2011, protests against mines and mines in development were happening weekly in almost every province in the country. So I asked him how he came to kind of see the whole set of issues and consider ecological concerns as number one. And what he talked about ecological concerns being number one for those who are protesting, and as he put it, for Kyrgyzstan. He said, in all protest events, it started with ecological concerns. Everywhere, this is at the heart of the issue. When protests began at Kuntur in May 2013, a journalist interviewed one person on the site of the meeting on the very first day who said, we don't need an improved road, internet, and such. We need environmental problems to be fixed. In Jete-Oguz, they have fear of the waste pond that it will affect them. In other places like Lalek or Al-Buqa, people worry about asthma, particulates, or mining developments right next to villages. In other places like Talas, they worry about drinking water and pastures. So he told me about his previous skepticism about what people's motivations were. And then he identified his shift in understanding why he started paying attention to the claims was because he saw images of what was happening with Kuntur. So he really needed to see the glacier, the photos of what was happening at the mine and satellite images. He says, I always try to say I'm not a hippie, and I'm aware and a realist. Environmental sustainability can provide money, it's part of the economy. But I came to this understanding when I saw satellite images and photos of rock waste on the tongue of the glaciers. It's a catastrophic situation. The Narin River has three sources. One is which the Kuntur River. We are digging out of trees' roots and it can't live. That same summer, I spoke to a government official who also said he didn't believe what he heard. He didn't believe environmentalist complaints about rock waste dumping on the Davidov and Lisi glaciers until he saw it with his own eyes. Well, it's not there. So what he said was he was flying back from Xinjiang across the border, and he looked out the window and he saw the mine from above. And when he saw it, it made him really angry. Before that, he didn't believe that this was really happening or the scale of it. After that, he started looking into it further and understood. And what both of these individuals point to is the need to listen carefully to not only what people are saying about their concerns, hear about their daily experiences to understand why they might feel and act these ways, that is, to protest, but also the tropes and labels used to dismiss and delegitimize those concerns. To also hear the different ways that miners and some residents see a mine, to listen to public discourses. But it also requires that we simultaneously take the 4,000-foot view. We need to think temporally how these issues emerge over time, not just looking at a protest event, but what builds up to that moment. We need to think spatially, holistically, and of course locally, at the ground level about people's everyday experiences, to understand better the dynamic views about nature and how they and we as part of nature are defined, discussed, and contested. So I've long been interested in studying water and contested politics and environmental change in Kyrgyzstan, and mostly interested in what wasn't discussed in much of the social science literature about these issues. Like most of you in this room, or all of us in this room, my work was motivated by reaction to top-down, elite-centered treatments of popular concern and political change. And my own experiences talking to people who identify different relationships with and within nature and politics than was captured by much of this scholarship. So today I'm going to describe some examples of my research and works in progress and reference others' works on these topics. I also very much look forward to hearing your recent research, so I can also grow as a scholar in conversation with you as I have before. There are people in this room who have shaped some of my work, and I'm really interested in critical work about contested politics and nature in Central Asia. The bulk of the research I'm going to describe here in Kyrgyzstan was conducted between 2009 and 2015. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so this is taking the 4,000-foot view. It's a little hard without being able to control it. So,
is that the right one?
Yeah, that's right. So this work was assisted by a whole bunch of research assistants listed here, including many who were AUCA students at the time. And my methods for this project include what I outline here. I won't get into the details, but you can see it. Most recently, I've shifted to a focus on participatory approaches and a particular photo voice methods, which I'm employing to look at how people are thinking about glaciers. And my goals as well for this work, other than publishing, in the process of publishing a few pieces, and also to share my research in an online interactive map that makes it accessible to people with whom I've worked here in Kyrgyzstan. So there are four overall themes in today's talk, which my work and others' work engaging in understanding contestation about within nature and contesting the very ideas of nature points to. One, the everyday. How studies of everyday experiences in Central Asia and average community members' daily relationships with and within natures reveals not only what life is like, but also provides insight into what issues become recognized as political at the national level. How some issues resonate and gain different political meaning and change over time. The second is non-protests, which is shorthand for paying attention to issues that aren't on our radar. In addition to traditional sites of contestation, such as street protests or formal parliamentary disputes, much can be revealed about social understandings of nature, emotional attachments to community and to nation, by investigating places where we might expect social mobilization and it seems absent. This warrants attention to non-protest, to silence, to everyday and quiet resistances. The third theme is the power of discourses in reflecting discontent and contestation and in shaping it. In particular, I'm going to point to some labels and tropes used by journalists, government officials, industry representatives, and activists about each other. The fourth is dynamism, the fourth theme. It is important to bear in mind that neither these narratives or the experiences, the daily experiences, nor the socio-environments about which we speak and study are static. So I'll outline a few of the many ways perceptions, experiences, and narratives used by these actors are changing over time. Examples include changing popular notions of glaciers and the role of images in shaping those shifts in imagination, what the possible reverberations are for the future, interacting with ideas about the nation and water, both at times discussed by government officials for political purposes and discussed in popular discourse as imperiled. I'm going to talk about imperiled ideas about the nation and glaciers. So scholars of politics focus on protests most often once they begin, when they're covered by the press. And then the focus becomes, are they authentic? Who organized or perhaps paid for this? What elites are involved? How does this connect to issues outside of the local place where this is happening? There are significant problems with this kind of narrow focus and framing, which I'll unpack. But as scholars, we have not worked well through understanding why issues become protestable to begin with. What makes an issue mobilizable? Among protested issues in Kyrgyzstan, anti-gold mining activities with environmental concern expressed by protesters as central became common since 2011 with the expansion of gold mining. And as gold mining expanded in each new province, we saw a new round of protests. So by 2012, we had protests happening weekly in almost every province in Kyrgyzstan. When considering whether or not environmental issues are at the core of these protests, some scholars might point to the absence of protests around serious environmental issues, such as radioactive mining, or uranium tailing sites, or industrial waste sites. And so it's obvious that communities have not mobilized around all environmental issues in the country. And it is possible that third parties might get involved in some of these protests. So I am not an investigative journalist unpacking the reality of some of those politics. What I am interested in is looking at shifting discourses about protesters and the ways in which these ideas of the third parties or top-down understanding of protests emerge. Some recent post-Soviet politics scholars uncover interesting patterns of protest and revolutionary behavior, mostly focusing on elites in the state, regime type and institutions, elite organizing capabilities, regional elite center relations, or state capacity and dissent control. Although these may be important aspects of the post-Soviet context, this obviously undervalues bottom-up movements, underclass political actions, and the substance of average citizens' concerns as a basis for politics, as well as the social triggers that catapult these issues into larger public's attention. So here are some examples from recent post-Soviet studies about how the public is typically enters scholarship about politics in the region. So this is some of the terminology that's used. The shape of public discontent and how non-elites, and, if you will, and community groups catalyze elite reactions and drive national political events is rarely centralized. Likewise, the bifurcation of protest events into either large-scale and national or local or small and narrowly local doesn't fully capture the national symbolic import and spillover effect of local protests, or the ways in which all of these actors across space learn from each other, shift their discourses in response to one another, and shape larger public conversations. So to my first theme, seeing the everyday. Some Central Eurasian scholars, especially those engaging in ethnographies and from critical approaches, have studied and listened for the cultural life of nature, observed community-based and participatory approaches to forestry and agropastoralism, used participatory research methods to hear these perspectives from those experiencing these issues. These scholars have greatly expanded our understanding and our ability to listen to and communicate these meanings. But this is not how most academics have studied environmental issues and realms in Central Eurasia over the last 2 decades. You'll note the relative recent aspect of some of this work. As David Goulet and Jean-Phil Delacroix point out, Jean's back here, in their introduction to Central Asian Survey's special issue, Everyday Energy Politics in Central Asia and the Caucasus, Citizens' Needs, Entitlements, and Struggles for Access. Much of the literature on Central Eurasian energy and electricity generation, for example, is focused on high or international politics, national elite politics, and often uses danger discourses. The dominant danger focus is also prevalent among research on water politics, which is the most common field tackling issues of water outside a natural science approach focused on water management. There are exceptions to this work, including those who critique development approaches to international practices, international organization practices in irrigation. With this growing literature on the ground level of analysis and bottom-up approaches tells us it helps us see realities and public responses to policies, cultural elements at work, but also informs work well outside of what is typically considered environmental. It reveals the intersection between environmental and social context. It's not until the cultural lens is used, a focus on how people experience nature is considered, do we see much of the environment as actually us as economics and politics. So, of course, this helps social science and practitioner understanding move beyond the typical approaches. Obviously, this is important in and of itself, matters ethically, but also it helps us all see processes of change, transformation, and resistance and not be taken surprised by such events. I'm going to give an example from my own work here that was in that special issue. It's called Kyrgyzstan's Dark Ages, Framing in the 2010 Hydroelectric Revolution.
Is that the...
Yeah, that's right. By the time I was preparing to conduct the study that I framed for you, starting 2009, about how nature and specifically water were understood, the energy crisis became a daily concern and frustration in Kyrgyzstan, an essential political topic, so it became a key part of my study. So I really just happened upon that in my work. A gap in understanding between decision makers, how they framed the energy crisis, and how most people in the country were experiencing it at odds with this official narrative, was centrally important in the frustration that led up to the 2010 ouster of Bakiev. My two main findings in this research were first that the administration failed to frame the energy crisis in a way that was popularly credible, and it backfired, and the government was blamed by a large enough portion of the population to instigate political action first at the local level. However, secondly, the nationalistic and environmental framing of the crisis, which the Bakiev administration used, produced a lasting echo in Kyrgyzstan's politics, which I'll return to as I get into gold mining. Thus, mass discontent, which was developing well before we saw any kinds of mobilizations, had a clear influence on political outcomes and elite behaviors later. So my work here is influenced by Heather Shaw calling for a more complicated social political view of revolution, Laurel's work exploring its central role of nationalist discourses in post-2005 Kyrgyzstan, and Mehta's work applying a political ecology approach to examine contested meanings of water scarcity and how scarcity is politically created through competing claims. Let me talk a little bit more about the details of this work. In order to better understand how people in Narin and Talas and elsewhere were frustrated enough to start protesting about electricity, I conducted surveys and interviews and looked at the narratives about what the Dark Age experience was like the year before the revolution. 1 year prior to the revolution, 71% of the people I surveyed answered that electricity shortages had a serious impact on them. This is no surprise to those of you living here. The Bakiev administration blamed dependency on neighboring countries and natural changes for the energy crisis. They called it a drought. They used terminology such as energy security and environmental security repeatedly. These phrases framed the issue as both natural and national, using defensive foreign policy language and identifying the key causes as purely natural and therefore beyond the government's control. Drought was discussed in passive terms. It happened to us. In my interviews and survey, only 6% of people accepted the shutoffs and shortages were caused mostly by natural changes in the environment. The remaining identified mismanagement or both mismanagement and natural changes as primary. People were roughly divided about how dependent Kyrgyzstan is on neighbors, with about 52% believing that it is. That is, dependent on dependent on neighbors for water and for electricity. But even among those who found that Kyrgyzstan was dependent on its neighbors for water and electricity, first blamed the Kyrgyz government and then specifically blamed Bakiev rather than neighboring countries for this dilemma. Some of them specifically called for his ouster because of this issue. Remember, this is a year before the turnover. This was well before the final months of privatization policies. This is in April 2009. So on top of the discontent that people had with their daily lived experiences with electricity shortages, and blame for mismanagement, a rejection of the natural causes framing, the administration began a tariff increase, as is quite well known. In March 2010, in this context, Bakiev blamed people for not economizing electricity. However, his family lived in luxurious contrast, and there were visible signs of that, such as Maxim's Soho nightclub searchlight, right, or the holiday lights on the streets that businesses were required to put up. The noise of generators bothered many who could not afford this alternative source. The sound of relative deprivation, as I recall my neighbors in Tbilisi saying in 1999, when they were becoming disenchanted with Shevardnadze prior to that change there as well. So the Kiev administration's tone-deaf framing of the crisis created intense popular opposition, while the nationalistic narrative resonated wildly. A sizable portion of those who blamed Kiev in my survey and in my interviews were upset about officials' illicit sale of electricity to the neighboring countries, which they saw as taking advantage of Kyrgyzstan. That is, a nationalistic narrative about water was partially created through this process by the Kiev administration. This is a photograph from one of the protests, small protests in Bishkek in 2009 related to those issues. The second theme I want to get into is hidden issues, or the non-protested ones. So I happened to see what was developing over time before what I could never have predicted would emerge. But also, there are many issues that we may be missing even when we follow an interdisciplinary, participatory, or bottom-up critical approach. So if we move from the most visible environmental issues, the ones we know figure prominently in people's lives, to the longer list of ecological damage or pollution woes, we can start to pull into view hidden issues, what we might refer to as silent Chernobyls, or the slow violence of the poor, as Dixon calls it. So what might some of those issues look like? There's some discussion of unregulated extraction by hands in multiple places, coal and gold mining. But some community members discuss this kind of approach as a form of community resistance to corporate mining. So to fully understand the differences in these mining approaches, we need to study those kinds of issues. If we think about Dixon's call for environmental justice research, about which there's very little in Central Asia, we might consider access to water in border areas and enclaves, access to electricity and exposure to pollutants in urban areas, concentrated, people working on landfills in Bishkek or Osh, for example. In 2006 and 2007, up to 5,000 people a day were working on light bulb waste hills in Mailusu, between uranium tailing sites and the city Svalka. They were digging out precious metals. Much of the focus of the press at the time, local and international, there wasn't much press, maybe you haven't heard about this, and among development folks, the international development community, was that the health concerns and safety, these are unregulated, it's an unregulated process. If someone would organize people, it could be better controlled. Commercialize it, capitalize it, make it part of a market process. However, these workers sold the tungsten and other metals to middlemen who traded them abroad on the metals market, which was entirely driven by rising and falling prices and consumer demand abroad, in particular in Germany. So what was happening in Kyrgyzstan was spurred on by a functioning, formal market elsewhere. There are many issues like this that we need to understand better, to hear the silence and understand fully the processes at work, to recognize what is not being said and understood. Protests are not the only sign of opposition. As well, visible opposition does not tell us all the local perspectives, of course, right? Often environmental issues, particularly corporatized, extractive, or visibly, noticeably polluting ones, are often divisive. They create conflict within communities. Mass mobilizations at times are indicators of divided communities, as in gold mining. Likewise, the absence of protest is also important, as it does not demonstrate the absence of concern or even the absence of political mobilization. Another way to look at what is not being protested is understanding how hegemonic discourses, in particular through dismissive framing of actors involved, is used to silence those with less power. This sometimes means where once there were protests, now there are not. At times because, as is often done in extractive industries in many countries, protests are criminalized. Part of this criminalization process is discursive. But these discourses do not operate to simply victimize some groups. Those being dismissed adapt and change. So dismissing opposition, demobilizing it, may silence it temporarily, but it may also create more frustrated responses in the future. That is, this dialectic creates conflict and continues. So my third theme then, you can stay here for a second. Stay here. Is on the power of discourse. So, I've talked about gold mining and other precious metals mining have been central national political issue in Kyrgyzstan since at least 2010 and arguably since 1997 when Kumtor mine went into production. These protests increased in frequency and intensity after 2008 with the rise in metals prices, increased openness to foreign investment, and subsequent mining expansion, especially after 2011. So worldwide, there were increases. There was an expansion of gold mining in particular and other precious metals mining after 2011. Political scientists might point to the expansion of protests in Kyrgyzstan after that point because it's a political opportunity. There's a revolution. There's change. And so therefore people are protesting. But actually protest process in Kyrgyzstan maps on to the global increase in protests and contestation about gold mining because gold mining has expanded. And this is expanded because gold prices changed as well. So this is just a timeline, a rough timeline that shows some of the key events in gold mining politics in the country. And I'm going to point to a couple of key things. You can see the increase in the number of events, and also you'll notice an increase in kind of more aggressive tactics used by protesters. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So, can you just go forward 2 seconds? Go back. Go forward one more. Yeah. I'm going to have you go back. Okay. So here's just a draft visual representation for another publication I have of phases, maybe we can call them, in gold mining politics. And this is me being a political scientist, and this kind of undermines some of my point. But in trying, one thing I was looking at is, especially if you map these discourses spatially about where the protests are happening, that we see a process of learning by all the actors involved in gold mining politics. So we really see first, after the cyanide spill in 1998, we see a focus on that with Kumtor. From 2005 to 2008, protests centered in Talas province against the operation and licensing of Andash and Jaroy mines, and those turned particularly contentious. In reaction to the confrontational aspects of those protests, the next period, 2008-2010, was arguably characterized by more cooperative approaches, if you will, local government-led stakeholder engagements, and what has come to be called corporate social responsibility approaches, mostly by Western mining companies, in response to the criticism happening here, which was happening worldwide where there was mining. That same period also involves environmental foils, that is, blaming some companies, in particular Chinese companies, as the bad miners, in part because they're not relying on CSR approaches. They're not seeking the social license, as it's called, as Western companies focused on. So during the 2010-2012 period, when most protests were held at various mining sites throughout the country on a weekly basis, Some of the most intense and at times violent protests were organized against a number of Chinese companies. Much news coverage of these protests fit in a larger narrative about xenophobia in Kyrgyzstan, ideas of resource nationalism, and popular mythologizing about a potential Chinese resource grab, rather than about the environmental concerns which were consistently present in all anti-mining actions. One piece I have in progress, China is Coming. I seek to better understand how these environmental claims intersect with economic justice, values, and nationalistic attitudes. I explore various explanations for community resistance to Chinese-operated mining and dissect industry explanations, government officials, and media discourses. Trying to understand the mythology shaping this. So what I'm focusing here on is I'm building off of critical geography and political ecology literatures on the power of identity politics in indigenous movement actions against global capital actors and the states sponsoring them. The particularly robust literature on underground ecologies and extractive industries. I think if you go forward. Forward? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Here, just a reference to some of the literature. I'm going to come back to refer to a few of them as I come back to climate change. But political geographers are really thinking about the ways in which corporate social responsibility works in communities. The ways corporate social responsibility framing, which is used to respond to conflict, has actually generated conflict in a number of instances. I explore the idea that the identity claims in Kyrgyzstani protests against Chinese mining companies demonstrate China's new role in global markets at a place where territorial sovereignty fears, global economic dependency, and existential environmental crisis align to create powerful incentives to resist in any form possible. I explore the idea that this kind of local environmental resistance, joining up with some nationalist claims, is not unique to Kyrgyzstan, is not primarily about foreignness, as Fairbairn points out. Rather, the naturalistic, if you will, nationalism, as Kaufman calls it, evident in anti-gold mining protests and violence against Chinese-operated firms in Kyrgyzstan, is one reaction in a limited menu of political choices when confronting global capital in an era of environmental uncertainty, as Bevington's work points to. People react to the idea that extraction becomes a part of life to come, becomes part of an imagination that cannot be erased. So it's about dispossession and opportunity. Why Chinese companies in particular? I will set that aside. If you have more questions, I can explore it. But the ways in which Chinese companies were used as environmental foils, in part, was by not naming them. The process through which Chinese companies have been categorized in local press as one unitary whole, by Western companies as one unitary whole. So in multiple interviews with gold mining executives, I interviewed about 44 individuals working for gold mining companies over this 6-year time period. Very few could actually name the mining companies operating even in the same provinces. On the Kumtor website, they actually have a page about its 8 myths about the Kumtor mine, and one is, who is polluting the Narin River? And in it, they blame, well, it's Narin residents because of sewage, and secondly, it's a Chinese company there, iron ore mine, Chetumto. They don't name the company. So there's this nameless menace that's used, and this framing in particular in a trope about Chinese actors in this industry. So, actually, if you could go back. Go back. So by 2012, potentially impacted communities became increasingly frustrated with the rapid expansion of corporate mining exploration in all provinces of Kyrgyzstan. I've said this. Despite corporate social responsibility attempts, right? Despite that approach. Corporate social responsibility, just so we're all on the same page, right, involves providing social benefits. So mining continues, but roads are built, or schools are rebuilt, or medical facilities are created. So in the last period of mining politics, the nationalist mood has begun to connect with public and some activist views of mining's threats. As you're all well aware, during 2012 and 2015, Kumtor again became a central national political issue, as images of rock waste dumping on the Davidov Glacier became publicly known. So before 2012, those issues were bubbling up, were being shared, but they weren't central. So one thing important to look at, I'm going to focus on one aspect of this period, is taking a critical eye towards popular labels of protesters. I already mentioned good and bad miners, but looking at how protesters' labels cautions us against painting all mining contestations as mere resource nationalism and forces us to think in nuanced ways about the political process of constructing relationships with nature. We can see how news media may reinforce or co-produce these images. So there's a long history of labeling and of protesters as criminals in Kyrgyzstan, beginning with the post-cyanide spill. Organizers in Barskaun, Kyrgyzstan organization, for example, was labeled and there were attempts to suppress their work by security services. The 2008 Joy and Andash protests, in which several people, 9 people, were arrested, several fled and have remained outside the country. That period is what originally drew my attention to criminalization through discourse framing. This is parallel to the same dismissive labeling used against anti-industry protesters everywhere. I'm studying in the U.S. how dismissive attitudes towards anti-fracking protesters, refer to them as fractivists, which is quite cool, have shaped their responses. We see the same thing happening this week with Native American anti-pipeline activists in the Sacred Stone Camp in North Dakota. Really interestingly, they are being asked to be called water protectors, not protesters. They're trying to preempt the usual media framing of protesters as unruly, disruptive, criminal. They're challenging the status quo and these usual practices. Here's a quick example from fracking of a similar attempt to silence protests, or silence simply dissent rather than protest. So we must consider who gets to define and key claims and concepts such as risk. Is it environmental, political, financial, or investment risk that matters most? Social responsibility, what does that actually mean? And acceptable dissent. So in my latest research, I'm starting to use Foucault's concept of governmentality to examine the last round of anti-Kumtor protests and dissect meanings and acts of repression. So I consider not only the acts of repression and of the state creating the proper citizen or patriot, but how these actions backfire, generate competing definitions, and force changes in corporate and state behaviors. So just a simple definition, thinking about creating a particular form of sovereignty through the government of people's conduct. This is one definition or simplification of governmentality. Governing is not always by the state. The power is exercised in multiple ways, so it can be governed and often is by corporate actors. And so criminalization, delegitimation happens through meaning making and discourse shifts. So we see this crook, fool, risk, harm. This reminds me of a quote by Mark Twain: "A mine is a hole in the ground with a fool at the bottom and a crook at the top." So this is a particular process identified in the extractive industries literature about how this happens. State actors seek to construct acceptable dissent and make the meaning of who is a patriot a good citizen. The mining industry actors seek to shape the meaning of harm or risk to minimize dissent. And in the face of that resistance, they shift to CSR approaches, corporate social responsibility. Both backfires. Residents redefine patriotism, resistance. They start blaming, distribute blame. For example, blame the corporate actors for not providing adequate services they sought to provide. So as corporate actors step in for the state, and they only do so superficially, they get blamed for not fully providing the services. And conflict this can generate a process of conflict. And then at times, state and industry collude to repress when corporate social responsibility approaches don't work. And there's quite a bit of literature on it. So let me give a couple of examples here. In addition to gold mining sector narratives of local residents' misunderstanding of environmental risk, if you remember from my first opening quote, Twain's fools without expertise or knowledge enough to be aware of the harmlessness of mining, this fools duped by outside interests, or the protesters as crooks themselves. These are powerful narratives easily picked up. I heard repeatedly used by government officials, many middle-class professionals in Bishkek, and on social media. We hear this discussion of protest in a language that evokes a natural, irrational, unreasoned behavior as a chain reaction, as reactionary resource nationalism. One gold mining executive mentions to me that it's the worst practice. It develops as a flash, like lightning. So the protest is the only moment in which any concerns are emerging. People just react emotionally, removing the agency of these organizers. What I found over that time period of protest is that they're networking with one another. They're learning from each other. They're shifting their tactics. Just as corporate actors are shifting their tactics and discourses, so too are those resisting mining. We can only see this by studying the history of anti-mining activism. So, in the context of frustration with business leaders and government officials' dismissal of local fears, we saw a change in how movement leaders chose to engage in dissent. If you go back one. So this is the protest on May 31st, 2013 that the first interview discussed. This is at Jetty Aguz on the south shore of Issyk-Kul. The march to Tamga, where the road to Kumtor leads. They created a blockade, protested for several days, and eventually shut power off to the Kumtor mine and engaged in a standoff with police, who cracked down on the participants. The demands were similar to Kyrgyzstan after the cyanide spill: ecological protection and social development funding. After 4 days of not getting a response, they burned a police bus, they shut off power to the Kumtor mine, and about 50 of them were arrested. This is, at the time, someone who was on Facebook posting images of other road blockades. So you can see this is in Peru, an anti-mining protest. So people were making the links between what was happening in Kyrgyzstan and what was happening at the same time elsewhere. And it was interesting. You could see how many comments there was. Very fascinating discussion of the two, the pro and anti-investors, captured in the first quote. It's interesting because this also drew attention from the administration. So Prime Minister at the time, Satabadiev, drove to Jetty-Aguz to meet with the youth protesters and said, "I can't promise you to change the existing agreement between Kyrgyz authorities and Centerra Gold in a matter of a day. I can't sort out all of these issues that have existed for the last 20 years, but you have inspired me in a promise to defend the interests of Kyrgyzstan." And those original reports really talked about the main demand being logical standards. Shortly thereafter, now I was interviewing some of the protest organizers during this time in the summer of 2013. Shortly thereafter, or 2 months after this rather, two of the young youth leaders, as they referred to themselves, were surreptitiously videotaped in a meeting with a sustainable development officer for Kumtor, threatening to block the road to protest Kumtor and take aggressive action. "We will start a war," was one of the quotes taken from this video. It was shared publicly. The two were arrested, charged with extortion, and sentenced to 7 years in jail. The release of this video deflated those contesting the mine, but also individuals from Jetty-Aguz organized to demand their release, saying that the videotape was missing time. And if you look at the original videotape, it has parts cut out. But this is example from international press. We saw very similar narratives in local press about thugs threatening to start a war, the criminalization happening at the discursive level. These two, in their final hearing, expressed a belief they were acting as patriots for their fatherlands, And what's most interesting is just this last year, a competing version of the video and a transcript of its surfaced, which includes the missing moments, in which, if you go back, do you need, right, if we work with opposition politicians, we will, you will be attacked. Do you need this? They go on to say, we don't want to do this. This is being offered to us, and we have no interest in this. So the competing videos really show a difference in how criminalization was framed in discourse and in reality. I can explain more what happened with Saru, but at this point, 16 men from Saru have been sentenced to prison for a range of terms between 4 and 8 years. 3 fled the country and are in exile. Others are in hiding. There are about 8 more currently on trial, soon to be sentenced, as involved in a process of protests that happened after this. And Saru has basically been in siege ever since 2013. An international human rights group went to Saru and was not allowed access, was run out by security services. So it's really an interesting process that we're not hearing much about. And you notice there haven't been protests as well. So we think about the no protests and issues and events are not necessarily because people don't care, but also there are ways in which silencing happens. So the last theme I'm going to take about 5 more minutes to talk about is recognizing the dynamism. I'll just give you a quick example of very similar kinds of framing elsewhere in Mongolia, where same parent companies operating in mining. You can see this eco-warrior, eco-terrorist. Journalists have a way with words. And this is mining protests in Russia. And we see the same kinds of narratives. So these are pretty typical. This is someone from Saru, an activist from Saru, the local Kenesh leader. What they learned by this process, they've responded to this. They're not just dismissed and silenced. They're continuing to work when they can, but they learned to videotape everything, to record everything. They talked about themselves as naive, as not understanding how the way they thought they were honestly addressing these issues could be used, or their past could be used against them politically. So, right, there's a video of them videotaping, right? They're videotaping from every angle their engagement with the company, and this is focusing on Glaciers at the mine. So I'm just going to show some images here of what people are responding to, right? So people in my research have talked about their mind, their views of the issue changing as they saw the images of rock waste on Davidov and we see glaciers. And also the images of shifting Lake Petrov as climate change impacts the Petrov Glacier and interacts with mining there at Kumtor. So see, this is Petrov Glacier and the extent to which the glacier has receded. This is since 1967 to 2012. You can see here another process of change. And here's the glaciers that form the back of the mine and the expansion of the pit and the second expansion over here. So this is then looking at in the mine. One thing I just want to mention, I'm not going to spend much time doing it, but Kumtor officials, I requested a visit to the mine in 2013, and they organized my visit. And talking to them, it's really interesting in which they're really talking about risk and threat and concern about the glacier in very different ways than what I'm going to show you now. And I think this is what they're really talking about is the glacier moving, in 2012, it was moving up to 4 meters a day because of the regime change, the glacial regime change with dumping rock waste on the glacier. And so what they're concerned with is images like this, that this would be most worrisome to people to see buildings on the site being destroyed, right? Because that's an investor, a concern for investors. What type of mining actually function there? They talk in lots of different ways about the glacier and mining, right? As an engineering issue, as like this is a God-given place where we can perform this kind of mining. It's incredible the technology that's been developed here. This is the only open pit mine in the world operating on glaciers. So this is a tested technology here in Kyrgyzstan. It's experimental. And it will likely be replicated in Greenland and a few other places where glaciated areas are being opened to mining. So it's a case that has global ramifications. But the ways in which miners discuss the technology and glaciers is in sharp contrast with the way the people living in the area are talking about it. So I'm going to show you some quotes here, but let me frame this a little bit. The politics of gold mining in Kyrgyzstan, as you maybe have caught already, is that they're in constant motion. Miners move rock, rivers, and even glaciers. Communities are mobilizing in opposition. Social movements and policy change is happening in multiple directions. Views of protesters have shifted along with corporate rhetorical change in reaction to social mobilization. At the same time, we hear companies talking about the country as inhospitable for development, stalled by political instability, non-resolution of major contractual issues. It's an alternative portrayal that the sector is static, not moving forward fast enough. But what we see here, what people are talking about, is how much the change has occurred. So I'm going to just mention work that I posted a little bit before by Julie Cruikshank. She talks about, her book is called Do Glaciers Listen? Local Knowledge, Colonial Encounters, and Social Imagination. Concerns about global climate change are giving glaciers new meaning for many people who previously have considered them eternally frozen, safely distant, and largely inert. Most of the world's glaciers now seem to be melting rather than reproducing themselves, becoming a new kind of endangered species, cryospheric weather vane for potential natural and social upheaval. Encounters with glaciers during times of rapid environmental change produce diverse interpretations. The narratives sometimes seem to be less about the actual glaciers than about the imaginative possibilities they provide. Glaciers portrayed as sentient beings in these stories seem to be good to think with, as Levi Strauss points to. So let me just show you some of these final narratives to conclude. I've heard these from people in my research. When I've asked them about the meaning of glaciers, how they experience environmental change, what seeing glaciers means to them, and the role of images and imagination in the process. This is where my work is in progress, but I hope it reveals a bit of where the history of gold mining politics to come and the dynamic aspects of it. So this is a person I just ran into on the street, didn't know I was doing work on Kumtur. Did you hear what Kumtur has done to the glacier? My friend was a member of the commission. This was in 2013. I asked, did she show you photos? Because I'm really focused on images, right? So I'm sure this person saw the photos, right? No, she didn't show me. She told me what she saw with her own eyes, and I respect and believe her. What she described was just horrible. How could they do this to our glacier? And so the discussions about the images even are resonating. This is from what she wanted to be called as a mother of an affected protester in Saru. I'll leave it at that. Why did your son participate in the protest? Glaciers is why. If there's an earthquake, there wouldn't be a lake patrol. If we think about what happened in Barcelona, it was a big stress for people. And what do glaciers mean to you? The lake, the next generation, it is for our grandchildren, what will remain. This is a local Kanesh deputy, and this is in 2015, last year. When I saw this image the first time, I thought of myself in nature. The image he's referring to is the rock waste on the glacier. My feelings were grandiose, powerful. The glacier was melting. I thought the glacier was crying to the sentient being. And this is a series of images to which people are referring. And then once people started referring to these images, I started bringing them back into interviews to ask people when they saw them and kind of try to understand this process. This maybe is familiar to you. Some protester, national opposition politicians' use of those images as well, right? So these have been used in lots of ways. This is with a government official last year. The general public wants damage to glaciers to stop. The Prime Minister wants to get compensation. We are interested in knowing how to make this work. So the resonance obviously is continued. Remembering the dual movement, though, as protests have been changed and what's acceptable has been defined. I want you to focus here. This is a woman who was blinded during the Barskoon incident. What does the glacier mean to you? The greatest gift, the best of life, the source of life. Many are saying that glaciers are shrinking. Again, this is about questions about Kyrgyzstan and Tengrichilik, thinking about philosophy of nature. And maybe pass that one. This is a city Kanesh member in Balachi. The Barskun incident was scary. I have trouble finding words to express how I felt then. Kyrgyzstan is nature. Nature is life. I taste and water. This is changing. Glaciers are getting angry. You can see also the note here, not all these people are against mining, right? There are complicated ideas at work here. Let them work except for the glacier damage. It makes me mad too. So that's the part that's really bothering people a lot. So let me conclude with a couple of thoughts. This is some research on climate change impacts on glaciers and runoff in Tian Shan. So connecting both the process of mining that's happening and impacting some set of glaciers to a larger process of glacier change. This is something people are talking about. I posted a photo that I'm in Bishkek, and I posted a photo from my hotel room, right? And someone, friend, actually he graduated from AUCA, taught here for a few years, posted that aren't those glaciers different? There used to be a lot more white stuff on the mountains, right? And I said, did you know what I'm talking about? It's like, no, I'm just looking at the photo images. So there are changes at work. And actually, when we look at what's happening with climate change, the region will face serious water supply issues starting in 2030, 2040 due to glacial decline. So the issue of climate change itself can be seen as unsettling and dynamic issue that generates discursive conflict in its own right around fundamental issues of knowledge, responsibility, scale, and place. This is what Barr, Gill, and Shaw say about discourse and climate change. When we study, understand elite behavior and decisions only tells us a portion of actions, influences, and possible outcomes. We must evaluate, study, seek to understand more. Forgive the bad metaphor, but we must broaden our understanding of politics or we miss the largest part of the iceberg. Doesn't quite fit. This is supposed to be a joke. You see, climate change, you have to have a joke. Okay, so contradictory environmental behavior, or the absence of a demonstrated concern, just tells us that lives are complex and choices are difficult and politics is problematic. We can't see that from looking always from the top. Visible opposition does not tell us all the local perspectives, as I've mentioned before. Protests are important but complex indicators. What is environmental is much more than natural resources or science, natural resource management. It's always political, economic, social, cultural, historical, geographic, linguistic, and more. What we can tell by paying attention to how people who live near glaciers tell us is that they're aware of environmental changes. So this is the research most of us are not familiar with. But when you talk to people who see glaciers every day or think about them as threatened for different reasons, like they're concerned or paying attention to mining, they are aware of this process better than most of us are, right? They see the process happening. It is changing not only how they think about glaciers, but how they imagine themselves. Thank you.
So I'm going to be teaching a class on CSR, and I've been reading student theses about community engagement by mining companies. Students are recommending CSR-oriented strategies. I kind of hear you saying CSR is a waste of time. How do you see CSR fitting into the bigger picture at this point, based on your research?
You mean in Kyrgyzstan?
In Kyrgyzstan.
I think that really the idea is CSR is a tool used when mining has been accepted, right?
Accepted?
Accepted, right? Or it is to make it acceptable. This is compensation for mining, right? So the question that I would pose back, I mean, it's a question to talk to students about or just in general, is were people in places where mining has been developed, or any other place where CSR is used? It's not just used in mining, right? Were they given the choice before CSR was suggested, right? Or CSR was provided, CSR approaches were used, right? Were they part of the decision-making process for development of mines? We have in Kyrgyzstan, there are laws regulating mining. There are international practices, environmental impact assessments, for example. And in most instances, these haven't been done. And so a very simple question is, it's not really a choice for communities if at the end, the way to get their appeasement, or to appease them rather, to get their agreement is to provide these kind of packages. When a community accepts corporate social responsibility, I heard this from interviewees in Talas, and from gold mining officials as well, is that they know that people are accepting it because they have no other choice to move forward. It doesn't necessarily make people happy, it's what they're given. So one thing, I can tell you this, CSR divides community to community. This is happening in Sukul, right? So once CSR approaches were used with Barshkaun and Tamga because they organized and protested. And so the neighboring villages got upset because they didn't get something, right? And so I've asked people, why do you accept these packages, or what are your understanding of them? And some of them say, we don't want the mining, or we don't want this impact. Some of them say, right? But if we're going to have to accept the mining, we at least want some of these other things. This company is making all this money, this is what we get. So the demands keep increasing, and this is what gold mining executives say too. You provide something and it's not satisfactory because the mining is, or whatever development that might create harm, is continuing. So what the literature on, some of the critical literature on CSR is that it continues a process of conflict. It may not, it's not resolvable.
Is it better than nothing?
Well, that's not what my research is about. Sorry. Go ahead.
I believe journalism and communication department in this team. About Kundor, I interviewed the public relations manager of Kundor, and he said that they had good relations with journalists, with all print and online and online. And then they also organized journalism school travel, and so they are providing press releases and all information, and journalists get all this content, and then they don't do investigation, they don't do analysis of data or English language articles, scientific. So there is no science and ecological journalism also in Kyrgyzstan. So what do you think when you are analyzing media? It's the only mainstream media catch up that includes discourse and also to or they also did some investigative pieces or this environmental activities used mostly not traditional but digital media on Facebook.
Yeah, sure. So, mentioned, asked about first Kuntur organizing, working closely with journalists and saying that they have a close relationship with journalists and organizing journalism school and trainings in the school province, and commentary about whether or not there's any ecological and science investigation going on among journalists. And so what is my idea or what my thoughts about what's happening? And that's changed over time, right? So it's interesting because there has been critical research on Kuntur, they're locally, not very much. There are a couple of journalists, most of them though, in order to try to get to publish critical work, local journalists seek to do so with international outlets. But, very importantly, international journalists also are not very critical most of the time about Kuntur. It's very limited critical understanding. So a lot of the tropes, and I use the English language, some of the English language news. We sped through image I have where I did content analysis of news coverage in Kyrgyz, Russian, and English. And some of the most simplistic narratives are used by Western journalists. So when you see more complicated, deeper understanding, it tends to be local journalists. It's just rare. And it hasn't happened recently. And journalists have, in more recent years, so since 2013, asked to be anonymized in my research when they didn't do that necessarily before election. So I think it depends on the period. And when there was more governmental critique of Couture during the contract process, there was more critical discussion, for example, about the glaciers. There's plenty that was critical in 2012, but not recently. Makes sense? I mean, relative to the issue, I think it's very high. But I mean, I know Western journalists who visited Couture and changed how they present the issue. So I think it happens. Sorry.
Presentation was very interesting. I mean, it's very well done to highlight the different narratives, especially on the community level. I have one question. I mean, seems to be a dichotomy between what's a national policy, national priorities, and local community priorities. And I mean, you showed the different attitudes and narratives. And I noticed one thing. So maybe one thing I don't know how did you address this issue? Our national government gives licenses for exploration, while the locally, especially what you mentioned, Chinese companies, what they actually do is mining, it's not exploration. So people in the Bishkek officials see exploration, while the local community see actually mining. And I don't know if you address this.
Yeah, so I've looked into licensing a bit. It certainly comes up in all of my interviews, right? Interviewing with government officials and how the licensing process was changed after 2010 with the new law on subsoils. And so there were some changes in some of the discussions changing the transparency of this process in other ways and speeding up the licensing process, right? So one of the aspects that all the executives focus on a lot is whether or not this process the licensing has been equal or not, problems with that. That's one of their main critiques. I guess I'm not sure I'm totally answering your question, other than it's probably the shadiest part of this process that when I'm looking at narratives and discourses is what people tell me and what I see happening. So I know that there were licenses given for one company in Chankal, a Chinese company, to explore, but they actually mined and extracted. There was a dispute that happened in Osh, in Alai, where a company was caught selling gold. So there are some instances of those. And in both of those instances, there was protest. And local officials were organizing as well against the miners, but it never got to the level of kind of violence that we saw against some Chinese miners elsewhere. But it's certainly something that has been happening in some cases. But not consistently, as far as I can tell. People know.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, who are the protesters? Because I was in my screen this summer, and firstly I was very surprised at the living standards compared to neighboring villages, and also when I spoke to some people there, they were so happy about their work and telling me how these mining companies what they meant to them. So I'm just wondering, who are the protesters? Are they the ones that don't get a share of it? The unemployed ones that might be used as the proxy argument for discontent of their life situation?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different studies looking at the different those who are neutral and those who support it. And for example, in Talas, in a couple of villages close to the Andash mine, the division of communities is roughly a third. This is pretty typical we find in mining towns, a third, right? Historically mined towns, so places where mining has happened for a long period of time, tend to be quite supportive of mining because there are a lot of more advanced mining experts. They've worked in the field, towns are organized as geological, like Palua, liquidation, for example. So it tends to be talked to begin with. But also, there are plenty of people who are working, for example, in animal husbandry, and as they see that as their future, who are organized or thinking about mining as threatening to their economic status, right? So there are people I've interviewed who, and I've asked this question often, right? Did you seek a job? Did you want a job? Did you not get the job? I've asked other people if someone else if they're maybe so this has been one of my interests, and I've heard from people I've never wanted a job, I didn't seek that job, I'm quite comfortable with the way I'm living, but I see that living less threatened. There are other people, I was approached in 2009 when I started this research by someone who was working for tour. So they were working there for several years, earning a good salary, and they said, this person said, I'm watching the rock waste being dumped in the glacier, right? And I can't do it anymore. And I'm making good money, and I don't know what to do, but I feel like this is an issue that has to be discussed because I see it every day in the future. So I think people are conflicted. That economy is not just about jobs, and I've seen that in multiple communities. And I've tried to systematically understand it by looking at mine for, been doing it for 6 years. I can't stop asking people to try to understand that better. So I don't think it's quite as simple as those who got job opportunities. Are there people like that? Some of them do, yes. But there at least are some activists, certainly Cadet, which organized in Barcelona, wasn't about jobs. They didn't seek jobs before they were reacting to that accident. But Barcelona and Tongao received compensation in 2005 for agricultural impacts from the spill, and they continued to ask for compensation and received different kinds of funding for the community. The road to Contour used to go through the middle of Barcelona. So one of their major demands was because of air pollution from the trucks, and road destruction, and house destruction. And they got that moved, they got new roads built because of that. So primarily that was an environmental concern and a local health concern. That things are, nicer roads, nicer fencing, all of that. There's constant investment there because of that. That doesn't mean people are necessarily, all people are necessarily happy to buy into investment.
Alex, I'm of University of Tübingen. So I was wondering whether you looked into why exactly Saru had the biggest amount of protesters, because if you look at Saru and Vasko, like there are 4 villages in between. Like there's Dafna, Chechkan, Kichijar, so why exactly Saru was the center of the protest? And another comment, since you look at the history of how this perception of Kumter mine evolved, do you think that Kumter basically spoiled its reputation when their truck with the poison turned over at the bridge somewhere and the water came to Isikul? Because in my understanding, because being from that area, like I'm from Dathan and my mother's relatives are from Saru, but we live in Tut, so but from my local perspective and from what I've heard from talking to my uncles who actually participated in the protest, and I have relatives who worked at the mine, so we're very much into it. And but basically, the Kumter's mine's reputation spoiled after that because the poison got into Isikul, and that was a big deal. They said, "Oh, our sacred lake, Isikul, like they poisoned it." And like in one of the pictures, you like there's a sign saying like stop the people who are poisoning everything. So this word poison, Ulan Daru, is coming from that period of time. And I can't remember if that discourse was there before it. I think before that accident, the truck happened, pretty much everyone was happy with the Kumtur mine. At least that's my perception as a local person. And another thing, like there was, sure. Then, like there's a physical development fund where Kumtur gives money to. So can you please make a comment on that? How people perceive that physical development fund?
So on the finance bill, I think yes. I mean, for everything, what you described as well from your family's perception of the issue is raised by not only everyone in school. I mean, it's like the memory of that, the memory of sending 3,000 people to the hospitals and checks. I interviewed last summer. I interviewed people in Barstown and Tongod, interviewing along villages and such, to try to get why protests are happening. I think I'm still working. I'll have some ideas, but I'm not sure I'm going to explore it right now. But I was talking and interviewing people who were impacted by this stuff, right? So people who have been asking for compensation through the legal process. And they, of course, refer to it. It's still like a holy buckle for them, for people in Moscow. People tears come to their eyes when they describe what happened. So people in Talas are talking about it. It's influencing how and why they're organizing. We don't want that to happen. And they talk about it as like a Chernobyl event. We know about the Adolf crisis. We know about Chernobyl. We know about Moscow. We don't want those kinds of things to happen here. And one difference, too, between what happened there is that, put your mind, as you know, it's not visible. It's not even human. You can't even see the glacier struggle, right? And that's a heck of a drive that really annoying to get to that line. It's nowhere near those villages on the south. Like, it's not visible. And we think about environmental issues often. This political science or social science say, well, visibility is what makes people protest, right? Like they see it and then they take action. It wasn't a visible issue until that spill, right? The glaciers were not visible, what was happening, until images of them were shared. So when I talked to Saru folks who were organizing, they talked about being part of a long legacy of people protesting against the mine. I think part of it was they think of Saru as impacted by the mine, but not gaining enough like other villages are, because some of the other villages have gained more from the fund. More money has been given to Saru over the last 2 years because of some of the noise, perhaps, while at the same time the town is still under surveillance, right? So those two things are happening at the same time. There are some people who've talked about, Saru folks are like this and that's why, and half people on God, there are all sorts of discussions about that. Maybe we can talk about that later. You had another question that I forgot what it was.
No, I think
Was that it? Okay.
The interesting comment a student made was that in the villages and the communities, they've lost all confidence in local government. And so I'm wondering, I don't think mention that as one of their findings, but we sort of assume that local government plays a role, but what they're saying is that the villagers are dealing directly with the mining companies and ignoring local government. I was wondering how that gets in there, if it's true, if you agree it's true.
Well, if you think about Saru, for example, local government leaders are involved in the protests, for example, and people see them as representing their and some people, very wise things are talking about people who have those concerns. In Jalalabad, so let me back up. Their protests were happening in Talas in 2008, 2007, 2008. When I did interviews there, so we did there in 2009, 2011, people talk about distrust from local government, not doing enough. But then people in Jalalabad, where mining expanded right in the next period, so 2008 to 2010, mining is expanding Jalalabad, mostly in Chankal. And there, local officials watched what happened in Talas. They saw how conflictual those events got. I didn't really mention it because I got into too much, right? It's a big issue, I'm right away. But in 2008, when protesters blockaded the road in protesting both Andash and Joy Mines, Prime Minister at the time, almost at my life, drove out to meet with the protesters, talking about the demands, and his motorcade was stoned. It was considered this, like, it was the most violent kind of protest. And there's a lot of disputes about who did it, with their tours. Environmental activists said that they were not involved in that, that they were the ones who organized the protest, so they were arrested. There was a complicated process. Local officials in Jalalabad referred to those moments for why they decided to change how they interacted with residents and companies. And so they organized roundtables to bring community members to talk to the mining companies. These were regular open events. I attended a few of them. And so local officials were discussed by residents at the time as being really representative and really engaging in conversations between miners and residents. So I didn't mention it much, but government officials are also learning and adapting at the local level, right?
But that was 8 years ago.
Yes.
Has it changed?
Yes. So what I mentioned so mining is expanding, and where protest mining is happening is changing. Well, actually, let me back up. I mentioned to another question. I mentioned mining in Alai province. In Osh province in Alai district, and there local officials were closely working with residents to call into question the operation of the mine. So local officials are varying the extent to which they are working with residents to be critical of mining or to work with mining officials. It depends which mining officials. So local officials continue to talk about Chinese mining companies as not communicating with them. So it depends which miners with whom they're cooperating in which provinces. And when I interviewed national officials, local officials, and some national officials who retain a close relationship with community members in their neighborhood or where they represent, they talk very critically about mining. Right? They really have their fingers on the pulse of local attitudes and concerns. But that really varies by individual. National politicians are local politicians. So some are learning and adapting to that process, and some are not. And in some instances, and this is where corporate social responsibility comes back in, if the companies are seen as taking the place of government, we see this in other sectors, right? Government officials are not seen as central as important. And so that CSR can work to undermine the status of local government, right? And so that is visible. I heard this, but I haven't been back to the loss to see to what extent it's changed there, but I imagine it probably has. But I could speculate that it might have changed.